Imagine if you had never heard the story, and I hand you a story, and it starts with a man who basically flies up to heaven in the first scene, and angels say, "Don't worry, he's coming back." Now, to us, this is familiar, but to somebody who's never seen this before, or to a historian, you have to look at this and say, this is already signaling to me that just in terms of the way we build historical knowledge, there are things in this that maybe I need to be cautious about. Acts contradicts, to start with, Acts contradicts the one source we actually have about the spread of Christianity via the Apostle Paul, and that is the Apostle Paul himself. But
it's kind of a big deal, kind of a big contradiction to have.
It's kind of a big deal. Some of the earliest kind of archaeologists going to Greece and Asia Minor maybe had the Bible in their hand, I don't know. But seeing things pop up in inscriptions that look a lot like Acts. So one example is this title of Polytarch.
Is the book of Acts actually historically reliable, or is that a major oversimplification of what's happening in the text? Hey, I'm Jordan, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the lands, civilizations, and archaeology of the Bible. This week, I'm very happy to be joined by Dr. CJ Cornthwaite for a discussion about reliability in the book of Acts. Are there details in Acts that we can say they got right? What about places where the text seems to not know what it's doing? Why is the author using historical details the way that they are? And what's going on with Paul in Acts? Because the Paul we have in Acts seems to be very different than the Paul we have in Paul. We're going to talk about all of this and more in this week's podcast. If you've ever had questions or gotten into an argument about the reliability or lack thereof of the book of Acts, this is the podcast episode for you. Remember, for early access to ad-free podcasts and exclusive bonus content like a weekly bonus podcast, you can join us over on Patreon. We are Bible and Arc on Patreon. But for now, settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation all about the book of Acts. CJ, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk today about a book we were just talking about that you have looked at, haven't looked at, that we haven't really looked at, but the internet loves to look at, Acts. Yeah. And if it's accurate or not. So thank you for coming by to chat about this today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor.
I am very happy to get to pick your brain on this because you recently made a video about Acts, and we're going to draw on some of that here, and I'm going to recommend that. The link is down in the description. If you haven't checked out CJ's YouTube channel, I don't know why you haven't yet. So check that out as this plays in the background. But when we're talking about Acts, I think for people watching this or for people who are watching you, something most everyone has heard about is this like Acts is historically accurate framework. Yeah. And it's an entryway into apologetics arguments or into textual or historical arguments. So can we start at the very beginning of this? When you are looking at the text of Acts, either now or maybe also in the past, and you're hearing these debates about accuracy, what is it that you hear people actually talking about when they say that?
Yeah, that's such a good question. It's like, I think as far as we think about the birth of Christianity, Acts is it. Like Acts is the story we tell ourselves. When I was a kid, it was the story I read and, probably had up on flanagraphs and stuff at church. Like this was the way we thought about the birth of Christianity. And it's interesting because like when you look at the history of scholarship, even over the last century, somebody like William Ramsey started to look at Acts and started to see like they're doing this archaeology in Turkey and Greece, and they're like, oh my gosh, in some ways it's so accurate. Like there's some things, and we can talk about them, that really do reflect, real historical knowledge on the part of the author. And that's fascinating to me. But I think on the other hand, it can become a bit of a like all or nothing type of approach, like because there's factual things in it. Therefore, we need to see the whole thing as a fact. And I think it's probably indicative of the way we approach this book when it is largely the only story most of us will ever hear about the birth of Christianity. It's easy to just take it for granted that it is historically accurate and not really start to pick apart things. I realized this when I went to do my my PhD thesis. My PhD thesis was in other diasporas. So I wanted to study like how do other ethnic groups in antiquity spread religion? And I found some good comparisons, and it was really fascinating. But the thing is, none of them actually looked like Acts. Like none of them looked like the story we get in Acts. So the question becomes, what is Acts doing then? Like, is it just that Christianity spread in such a way that nothing has ever spread like that again or since? That's one position to look at it, but I don't think that's a responsible way to look at it as a historian. You have to start asking questions about what is Acts trying to do. And I think really the lights start to come on when you start to pay attention to the moves that the author's trying to make, trying to connect Acts to Jerusalem, trying to explain how Paul, all of a sudden, this figure who never met Jesus, becomes the central point of this movement. And when you look, I won't start naming things right now, but that's when you look and you start to see there's some real problems with the way we tell this story, real like contradictions, even within the way that Paul tells his story. And that's where it starts to fall apart. So all that to say, to wrap up the question without going down too many of the rabbit holes right now, Acts, I personally see Acts as a 2nd century story, or a 2nd century, maybe I can even say myth, about a 1st century origins that probably has a little bit of historical accuracy in it. But when you really start to pick it apart, it seems to be more interested in the fights of the 2nd century than of the 1st century.
Can I ask about the myth versus story when you're using that term here? Because that might get some people's ears up to say, you're talking about Acts and throwing in that term. Why would you say maybe use myth here instead of story?
There are different ways to define myth, and I don't even think I'm always very consistent when I use the word myth. But I think sometimes it's important to use a word like that just to really stop and kind of help us to see things differently. I'm not trying to get people angry if they've seen this as history, but let's just think about this. And like, if we step back and we didn't know this story, and maybe let's imagine we weren't in this religion, if I assume a lot of your viewers are, and we've heard these stories our whole life. So imagine if you had never heard this story, and I hand you a story, and it starts with a man who basically flies up to heaven in the first scene, and angels say, "Don't worry, he's coming back." Now, to us, this is familiar. But to somebody who's never seen this before, or to a historian, you have to look at this and say, this is already signaling to me that just in terms of the way we build historical knowledge, there are things in this that maybe I need to be cautious about. Now, I know that sounds like such a skeptical, skeptical historian's approach, but it's just the way we have to approach these things. So when I say myth, I'm usually talking about a larger than life origin story. That's a really too simplistic, but a nice way to think about mythology. That is not to say there's nothing historically accurate in it, but the way that stories get told, things get reworked. If I can give one more example, and it's not from Acts. When I looked at other diasporas, when I was like doing this research into other diasporas in antiquity, there's one story that does look like Acts. There's only one that I really found, and it's an inscription. So it's an inscription from a Greek island of Delos, where there was a lot of immigrants settled there, and I did some of my studies there. So this inscription is from a man, and he tells the story of how he's a priest of Serapis. So Serapis is a Greco-Egyptian deity. So he's a priest of Serapis on the island, and he tells the story in this inscription of how his grandfather brought the god Serapis to this island. And then how in each generation, how the god kind of worked, and then how Serapis came to be worshipped here. And it's interesting when you read this. I actually have a video about it on my channel. I worked through it, but there's a lot of really familiar things about God. I'm going to say the god. It sounds weird in English. I could just say God. Like Serapis is talking about like giving the grandfather clues, giving them dreams, telling them what to do. Like, oh, we need a place to build a sanctuary. And I was walking, this is the grandson, I think, says this. He says, I was walking through the Agora and I saw this sign that this piece of land was for sale, and it was full of mud. It was disgusting. And the god said, this is going to be for me. And then they work, so you get this story that always works better when it's told in reverse. That's where I want to get to with myth. It's like, this story always works when you tell it backwards. Whether or not, if you could have a video camera and see things going forward, that's what you saw. That's probably not true, but there's truth in it. And this is how we often tell stories. So that's what I think of as myth. It's like, again, not that there's nothing in it, but we have to kind of read it for what it is, I think.
I think introducing that when we're having a discussion about historical accuracy in Acts is very helpful, because it's easy to jump past that beginning part to get to some of those details that people point to as, look how accurate the place names or the locations. And you can just bypass something that opens the whole thing. Was there a moment for you when that kind of clicked into your reading of Acts as someone who has spent a lot of time in it, but also you grew up with it in a different way.
Yeah.
Was there a real moment where it kind of shifted?
I think it was coming back to that diaspora thing in my PhD, because I was like trying to do the comparisons and like, oh, this doesn't quite look like what, and the evidence isn't perfect. I'm not lining up 3 books that look like Acts and comparing them. Like essentially I'm trying to compare inscriptions for the most part is what I use to build these like diaspora, like the history of these diasporas. So it's not perfect, but I think what I kind of realized eventually is when you look at, let's just take that example of diaspora in Acts, we all think of Christianity as spreading through a Jewish diaspora. And I'm on board with that. That makes total sense. But when you hear the story that's told in Acts, you see like it again and again, you see the same thing happening. Paul comes into a city, finds the Jewish synagogue, goes and tries to preach there. And for the most part, they say no and kick him out. And then often it's like people near like God-fearers, it's this word, or like Gentiles near the synagogue who pick up and convert to this new way. And when you see this happening about 5 or 6 times or whatever it is, you start to pay attention, hopefully, and you wonder, why is this always the same story? That in every case, Jews reject, Gentiles accept, and the synagogue or the diaspora, if we could think of it as like this Jewish diaspora, isn't actually something the author is that interested about. It's more just a foil for how Paul becomes the guy, like, and how the Gentiles become the movement. And if I'm reading this in the 2nd century and I'm a Gentile, it's like, well, that makes sense. That's why we have this, because Jews rejected or whatever. So I looked at that when I was doing my PhD and I thought, I think this is actually more literary convention than history. Does it rhyme with history? Maybe at some point Gentiles started following this religion too. But I don't think it's quite that simple. So that was really where, when I realized I just couldn't use it, and I had really hoped to have this nice bow I could tie on the end of my dissertation and say like, and that's where we get, that's how Christianity spread. That was the problem Acts gave me, is it just didn't really fit that nicely.
Acts actually kind of came in just to take your legs out at the end.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
How kind of it. Can we talk here about literary convention?
Yeah.
Because I want to cycle into some of these details that people have probably heard before.
Yeah.
That you've teased a little when we're talking about things like the cities or travel routes or, names that show up or titles. These are those pins that people will put in and say, because of this detail and this detail, okay, we're starting to get a historical reality or the feeling of a real sense.
Yeah.
But if we're functioning in maybe more literary models than just historical models, how should we be turning back to consider the way these things come in? Can we discern between what is, a literary tool and what is a historical tool? How do you come into this?
I don't think it's a perfect science. And I think when you look at how the scholarship breaks down on Acts, you'll see a lot of disagreement. So, the speeches are a great example. I look at these speeches in Acts, and some scholars will say all of the speeches have very similar cores. No matter who's speaking, they look somewhat the same. And that's evidence that these are complete literary fabrications. And some scholars will look and they'll say, well, there's subtle differences, for example, between Stephen's speech in Jerusalem and I don't know, like the speech of somebody in Asia Minor or something. Like there's differences between them. And scholars can disagree, like reasonable people can disagree. So this is where you start to really, it starts to really hurt your brain, and it's a difficult place to get to, because we can't always pick apart what's literature. And, like we talk about these we passages, this is a famous part of Acts for people who don't know, is that it'll kind of dip throughout Acts. There's a few different points, and it often has to do with sailing, but not exclusively. And the author says like, oh, we did this, then we did this, then we sailed around here. And people say, aha, eyewitness, like undeniable. And to that, you have to say, it's possible, but there are also literary conventions doing this. Even like the Odyssey, for example, it has these kind of like, it's kind of this first person narrative of travel documents. So this is where you can just really like trying to read the history of this just really can grate you sometimes, because we just don't know. Like, was there a source that had some kind of accurate, like, I don't really know. I'm skeptical for other reasons, but in a lot of ways, we end up just having to let Acts be Acts. And a lot of historians are going to make up their own mind about it. So
what are some of the other reasons that you're skeptical?
Well, it's interesting. Like if you look at, so when we look at Acts, a lot of people will like to point to what's accurate. And we could maybe talk about that in a minute, but Acts contradicts the one source we actually have about the spread of Christianity via the Apostle Paul. And that is the Apostle Paul himself. But
which is kind of a big deal, kind of a big contradiction to have.
It's kind of a big deal. Yeah. So if you look at how Paul, the way that I like to think of Acts is basically what Paul wishes were true for himself. Like Acts is basically Paul's imagined reality come to life and put on paper, in the sense that you have Paul, like if you read Paul's letters, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians are great examples where he's fighting about his own authority. And in Acts, Paul doesn't need to fight for authority. He's given authority. It's just this body of the Jerusalem Council, which, by the way, I don't actually think is a real thing. This body gives Paul the authority. So like you look at where Paul is talking about things like in Galatians, Paul basically says like, I didn't go to Jerusalem after I converted. I waited a long time. And then when I did go, I only met with Peter and James. And then in Acts, you have him going to Jerusalem right away. And not only that, but he's from Jerusalem in a sense. I mean, they do say he's from Tarsus, but he spent time there under Gamaliel, this famous rabbi. And he's done all this training. He has these credentials from Jerusalem. And then when he goes to Jerusalem after his conversion, he meets with everybody. And like, so there's these kind of subtle things. But then you have to, when you read between the lines even more, you look at, for example, in like 1 Corinthians 8, where it's talking about meat sacrificed to idols. And Paul is fighting about why people shouldn't eat meat sacrificed to idols. And if you look at Acts, in Acts, the Jerusalem Council actually gives him a mandate and like says basically, Paul is right about this. Here's a piece of paper you can take to all the churches. And like, this basically proves that you're right. And you think Paul would have mentioned that in 1 Corinthians if he has this letter from this authoritative body that is responsible for all of the Christians in the diaspora. So like, it makes a lot more sense when you read it backwards. Like when you read Acts as the thing that's pulling from Paul's letters and trying to build a history around that. And not only that, but leaning into Paul's authority and saying like, yes, he does have authority, even more than he apparently actually has in his letters. So that's where you start to look at those types of things and they start to really fall apart. One of the other things that I find really interesting, and actually this is not my work, but my supervisor, John Kloppenborg, has done some work on this, is like what the author actually knows about geography. And if we look at Luke and Acts together, we can see that this person obviously knows a lot about sailing on the Aegean, knows a lot about like trade winds and stuff, knows a lot about Asia Minor and Greece, doesn't know very much about Jerusalem, doesn't really know much. There's this famous thing in Luke where Jesus is taking this journey down like kind of in between around Galilee and Samaria, and then like 8 chapters later is still near the Galilee. And it's like, it's kind of the work of somebody who doesn't actually know what it feels like to be on the land there. Obviously knows Greece and Asia Minor, but doesn't actually know that, or this author will make like Nazareth and like Bethsaida and some of these places the author will make into like Greek polises, which is like formal cities. And these are just little hamlets, like if anything, So this is where you start to see maybe hints that the author doesn't know all that much about life on the ground. And I actually think, in one of my videos, I pulled this apart, but I think the author uses Josephus. I rely on Steve Mason a lot. This is not my work. This is his work, and it's fantastic. But you see the author is able to rebuild these incredible exchanges between Paul and like Festus or Paul and Agrippa. Like you see these kind of incredible, these like things that are laden with details, but then the author doesn't know some of the simple details about the geography. So to me, that's not eyewitness. That's again, like coming back to like author who can read sources. Anyway, I'll stop there because I'm kind of getting in probably into the next question. But.
Well, no, I think that's a perfect way to jump in because those like, where do they know something that feels like it has a source and where don't they? Where are they getting out over their skis is a helpful distinction point to understand how they're going about doing this.
Yeah.
So I think you've already laid a couple out here, but for people who are thinking, I maybe have never even heard of people really saying Acts is historical because of these details.
Yeah.
What are the ones that come up most often as good ones that maybe have something behind them?
Yeah, I think some of the earliest kind of archaeologists going to Greece and Asia Minor maybe had the Bible in their hand. I don't know. But seeing things pop up in inscriptions that look a lot like Acts. So one example is this title of Polytarch, which we can see in inscriptions from Thessaloniki. And even like, this is really specific, but even like in Berea, like the kind of region around Thessaloniki, we can see this title. So like, obviously the author knows something about this specific title. And that's maybe he got it from literature, but maybe not. Maybe he was just there. It's a very kind of subtle thing to know, and it feels a little bit like local knowledge to me. Or the other famous one is like going to Ephesus and having this position of Asiarch, which was a position in the koinon of Asia, which is kind of the structure that formulated the worship of the imperial cult across like different places. This was a position, and it was a real position. So like when Luke, the author of Acts, thinks that Paul knows an Asiarch, and this Asiarch is friends with him, that's interesting. That's a really interesting historical detail, and maybe it's verisimilitude, maybe it's like an actual legend. I don't know, but it's super interesting that part is right. So this is the kind of stuff. Like there's Gallio, for example, is the name of somebody who's the proconsul of Achaia. Now I argued in a video that one might come from literature. It's Seneca's older brother, so Seneca mentions it in some of his books. But yeah, I mean, you start to piece together these really accurate things, and it could be verisimilitude. Maybe the author's just well read. Maybe the author's well read and well traveled, which I think would make a lot of sense. But yeah, it's tough to really, it's to some extent, that's where the historical accuracy lies. So yeah, those are some of the things that are like people will point to and say like, aha, there's that figure's right. Now, the one thing I said, I just did a video on this last night, but I was thinking about how we construct history. And in Ephesus, for example, there's this guy named Sceva, who's described as a high priest, which is interesting. I don't know. He's apparently a Jewish high priest. I don't even know what that means in this context, but he has 7 sons. These 7 sons try to perform an exorcism in the name of Jesus, and the exorcism fails, and the guy jumps on them and basically beats the crap out of them. And then you keep reading down, and this is where all of a sudden Paul knows an Asiarch. So if we're being responsible historians here, and we see an account of an exorcism right next to the account of a very accurate provincial title, I don't know. I mean, some people are going to say it's all historically accurate, maybe, but like I've been in churches that wouldn't accept this story if it happened down the street, So this is where we do have to, and it's hard to do this with our sacred books, but this is a reality. Is sometimes we need to step back and say like, well, how do we understand this story working, and how do we understand these things that are probably what we'd call verisimilitude, just kind of betraying what the author actually does know. There's more you can do with that than just saying the whole thing's true. Like it actually is really interesting to pay attention.
Can you explain verisimilitude for someone who's thinking, I've heard this term thrown around in these discussions, but
it's just
I can't quite define it.
It's just like the appearance of truth. Any literature, I think like if you read Harry Potter, you're going to read about places like King's Cross Station. You're going to read about certain life in London. That's very accurate. So that's verisimilitude, and it's real. If you've ever been to London, you can go to King's Cross Station. I took my kids there, and we got a picture under like the Harry Potter thing. But if you go looking for like Diagon Alley, I'm going deep here on the Harry Potter references, but you wouldn't find necessarily everything mentioned in Harry Potter. So right. This is essentially, when you're telling a great story, this is the wallpaper. It's the furniture in the room. It's the things that, like, you open a Spider-Man comic and it's maybe set in, oh gosh, I don't even know Spider-Man. I think it's set in New York. I don't know very well. Yeah, New York. Yeah. I just got way over my depth with my comic book analogies. But anyway, any great story has a setting, and I think that's essentially what we're seeing. So
when you see it showing up, I think the 7 Sons of Shiva is a great example.
Yeah.
Where you have a moment of something next to that. Is that a wallpapering for you? That's the way you read that? I
don't know. This is where you can really drive yourself up the wall trying to figure out what's real and what's not, right? Like, is that
how do you split it apart?
Yeah, and I don't even think you always can. Like, I think we should talk about when we get to historical accuracy in Acts, I think it often is more useful to think about what it tells us about what the author is trying to do and where the author is trying to situate the movement. Because when it comes to trying to locate these independent details, I just don't know. Like, it's interesting, like you'll read through and you have like Lydia, the seller of purple. Like, that's a really specific detail, and it might be a real historical detail, or when you have, then the author says, oh, and there was a certain centurion there or something. It's like, well, that's kind of vague, and that seems a little more skeptical. But how do we know? This is where I think, I don't really want to go to the camp to just say none of it's historically accurate and none of it, like, I don't really know. I can have, suspicions about certain things, but this is just the fascinating circle you can get into of trying to figure out what's real and what's not.
Are there places where it feels like that certainty, the terminology they know, or the titles starts to fall away?
I think it's more that it's sprinkled throughout. I'm trying to think specifically, but I don't think there's a lot of chapters that you wouldn't find something that, well, the beginning. I think the beginning, I mentioned the Jerusalem Council already. I think the beginning of the activity, kind of the beginning setting of the book, like Jesus goes up to heaven, the disciples choose a successor to Judas, and like you have these incredible scenes in Jerusalem where like Peter's speaking and like speaking in beautiful Greek rhetoric, which is hard to see as historically accurate for somebody who's a fisherman from the Galilee. Maybe that's part of the gift of the Holy Spirit, I guess. I think that's probably what the author wants you to think. So like if anything's complete fabrication, I actually think it's probably those chapters. Like it's probably how you get the movement from Jerusalem to Greece and Asia Minor. That is probably the fabrication, if I'm being really cynical. And then I think what you see in Asia Minor and Greece feels a lot more like it's got a little more like texture to it.
When you're coming back to it then, instead of trying to distinguish, detail A is over here in the historical and detail B maybe not, and instead is coming to the what is the author trying to do? When you see the verisimilitude showing up or the dropping of whatever you want to identify it as, what do you see as their through line?
I think, there's a couple. I already mentioned the diaspora one, which is important. I think essentially, if you look at telling a story in reverse, let's put it in the second century. A lot of scholars do. I'm going to, for the sake of this conversation, and I think the author knew Josephus. So, to me, that tells me maybe there are sources that are earlier that the author drew upon. Obviously, we know in the Gospel of Luke, the author is drawing on sources. But in any case, let's imagine Acts being a second century creation. So I think if you look at, and this is not my work, but I just reading great Acts scholars, and you put Acts in the context of a Christianity that's diverse, has a lot of different schools, has a lot of different ideas, all of a sudden Acts starts to make a lot more sense as the unifying narrative for a group that will eventually become the one that owns this story. So that could look, for example, in Acts chapter 8, there's a fascinating story about a conversion of Simon of Samaria that we call Simon Magus. Now that's a slur. Some people will say not to say that. But it's very like Simon Magus has a similar kind of resume to Jesus. He's a wonder worker. It seems like some of his followers might have thought he didn't die. No, I'm getting that mixed up. But some of his followers thought he was like the Son of God or something. So there's similarities to Jesus. I'm going to have to go read my Simon history again. I'm a little rusty on it. But anyway, there's similarities to Jesus. And I think what you can see if it's a second century movement, and there's still people following this person in the second century, is all of a sudden having him convert to the Christian movement is a pretty powerful rhetorical tool. And I think that's what others have argued, and I do find it convincing, but it's less like generally accepted by scholars, that Acts is also a reaction to Marcion. So Marcion thinks that essentially Jesus came to kind of set us free from the Jewish God. So having a story that puts very firmly the origins of this movement in the Jerusalem temple and the Jerusalem movement, and like connecting it all back to Jerusalem, makes it feel very makes it feel like something that could actually be used to counter Marcion's claim. And actually, when we see people start to quote it in the end of the second century, that's kind of where they go. It's often like challenging Marcion. So starting to see those kind of moves, to me, it's like, what is the author trying to do? Who would this story serve? You have people like Marcus Vincent, for example, who has argued that Acts was actually composed to be the kind of intro for Paul's letters. As people started to read them more, Acts became like the thing that would be read first. I think that's a really interesting argument. But those are like, even if you accept or reject that particular argument, to me, those are the questions that are much more fruitful to ask, is like, what is the story doing, essentially?
Is there a collection of literature that you think the audience who would have been engaging with this, or that the author had in mind for the audience to have in their hands, that like listeners or readers today should be going back to? Because for most people coming to it, I think they think of Acts just in the context of the New Testament books that come before and after.
Yeah.
And yet you're throwing out things like the Odyssey here, or maybe awareness of Marcion, or Pliny, or like there's this whole other world of literature that exists outside of the New Testament. So are there some of those texts you think people should really spend more time paying attention to care about Acts?
To understand Acts. That's an interesting question. I think like Acts is a different, we do have historical sources, and even Josephus would be like this, who will say, I guess Pliny does this too, who will say like, talk about miracles or miraculous supernatural things and say like, it is said that this. So like they distance themselves a little bit from the supernatural claims. The author of Acts doesn't do that. We have some stories, I think like Livy would be an example, where like the story of Romulus ascending to heaven, like the fictional founder of Rome, gets worked in as part of the history. So like there are some comparable things to the stories in Acts, but then it's also just, I mean, the author is drawing a lot on, I think on Josephus. The author obviously knows the Septuagint, so like the author is a pretty well-read individual, and I think I'm not saying everybody who wants to understand Acts needs to read like everything from the ancient world to understand it, but I do think that helps you to get a bit more of a flavor for it, is seeing it as a product of its time and a product of somebody who stands in between probably Jewish and Greco-Roman literature and understands them both quite well, which is interesting. So the author is obviously a smart cookie.
Who do you see as the author in your mind? Because you're laying out here well-read and well-traveled. Like, do you have a sense or a picture of author or authors behind this?
I don't. I really don't. It's a good question. I don't have, I mean, other than saying like, this is somebody in this proto-Orthodox movement, probably maybe responding to Marcion, maybe responding to Simonians, maybe trying to like tell the story of how this goes back, like ties back to Jerusalem and how the Jews rejected Jesus and now it's a Gentile religion. Like all of these things but you need to find somebody who fits that kind of authorial profile. I don't have a name. I don't really even have a sense of who. It's something I'm comfortable not really knowing, but it's more interesting just to think about what type of person the author is, I think.
What type of person, what they're trying to do. One of the things that you mentioned earlier that they're trying to do, which I love as a description, and I want to ask more about, especially in this context of maybe Acts is setting up the rest of Paul. As you said, that Acts is what Paul wishes was true. And yet the Paul we have in Acts, as you've already explained a little bit, is almost like an entirely different Paul than the Paul that Paul describes of themselves.
Yeah.
How do we fit those parts together of like the wannabe true Paul and the real Paul, and those two Pauls are not the same?
I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure. It's funny because I can talk about contradictions and stuff, and I'm not sure. I mean, I read these my whole life and certainly never saw them as a contradiction up until I really got, turned into one of those cynical Bible scholars. So, I think it's funny, like they do contradict if you really pay attention, but you can kind of make them work. And I think that's kind of the, if you really stop and ask, like leaving Paul aside, is Peter a reasonable characterist, like a character who we could imagine somebody who's raised as a fisherman in the Galilee and all of a sudden is this like bold leader of a movement? Well, maybe I'd be a little skeptical, So to me, it's not that these people, like, it's funny because when we read these devotionally, we often do see these people and we see a through line, and it never bothered me until I started really paying attention. So I think it does contradict Paul if you really read carefully. But I think it contradicts in a way that just accentuates Paul's power and rhetorical ability and intellect and the Jerusalem council giving him this blessing and all that. So I think it's somebody who, I don't think it's a complete contradiction of Paul's letters. I think it does build on them and take some creative license in ways that if we really pay attention, exposes the author. But I don't think they're totally, in the author's mind, I don't imagine these would be totally different people, if I could say that.
Yeah, it is interesting in the way they play with the characters. And a lot of this comes back to that, where you started this in talking about how we read this maybe as myth instead of as something else. That we do this, but maybe also aren't aware of when we do it, how we fix difficulties between characters or timelines, just kind of passively without keeping tack on it. And yet we'll turn around, some individuals will turn around and say, but this part is accurate and this part is accurate. And it's just, it presents itself as an odd back and forth text that, I don't know. It kind of surprises me how often it comes up as the one everyone wants to point to say like, well, because of this, then everything else.
Yeah, it's true. And then I think for me, like one of the most interesting things in biblical scholarship is, sometimes I make these videos that are like Bible scholars are wrong, and it's like it's a little bit tongue in cheek. It's a little bit like I'm playing for YouTube a little bit, but it genuinely does make you stop and think. If 200 years of biblical scholarship are based on this text being a historical foundation for the movement, we could start to pick apart little things. But what happens if you pick apart almost everything in Acts? Then what do we know about the birth of Christianity? very little. And that kind of puts us back at the beginning. And to me, to some people, they're probably tearing their hair out. But to me, that's really interesting. And people look at this discipline. And sometimes I get people in my YouTube comments being like, what else do we have to learn about this? It's been, how many years, like how many centuries of biblical scholarship? And like, you start to just take an assumption that shapes a field and pull that assumption away. And it's like, whoa, we can just basically start over. And I don't know, it's wild to me. And there are a lot of things we just may never know too, which is also a frustrating part of biblical scholarship, is we want to be certain about things, but sometimes you just have to, make yourself, I think often Bible scholars, what we end up doing is we kind of come up with our best explanation and we hold it, and other Bible scholars, reasonable people, will disagree with us. But it's kind of just, we satisfy ourselves to the best of our ability, but we may not be able to satisfy everybody else,
The picking away at that assumption is such a helpful way to frame it, that it's, well, why come back? Why come back and do this thing? You get the same questions of, why is there another book about King David? Or why is there another thing on? You're like, well, yeah, some of it's been said.
Yeah.
And yet, so much of it can be built on one person 150 years ago said this, and we've all just moved along.
Yeah.
And yet, if we say maybe the travel narrative style in Acts is related to other travel narratives and doesn't have to mean that it's really that, things can drastically shift in the way you read it, or even what stands out to you, because the way you read it and the way you feel about it can be related and can also be different.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
For you, as someone who comes to this, having gone through the path that you have, when you're returning to Acts and asking some of these questions that are, what assumptions can I take away, or what is historically reliable or accurate? What's the thing you hope that people take forward, that maybe they're not going to go and ship all those things away, but is the thing they should keep in mind when they're coming back to reading these texts, be it from a place of faith or not, from love or not, to help do that same work themselves?
Oh, that's a good question. I think to some extent it's like, our stories can be powerful without needing to be 100% true. So if like faithful readers, like I still read these stories and they're meaningful to me. I still go to church. I'm still, in a faith community. So, if I'm putting on my church hat and like living in this story a little bit, as we tend to, that's probably what ends up happening. I think just really, and I know like there's so many people who are just fascinated by the history of this. And I think it's just fun to step back and say, like, if we look at this text and assume that it may not all be 100% accurate in that sense, what would we not know about the birth of Christianity? What questions would you have? If you assume that the author's trying to, let's say, for example, the author's trying to cancel other people's stories out, what would it be like if we listened to those stories again as a legitimate part of the expansion of Christianity? So to me, that's all is just, the average armchair person reading this book, it's like, let's recognize this. Just like, even a lot of Christians are doing this now. If we read Genesis 1, we're not saying like, oh, this is a eyewitness story of how God created the heaven and earth. Like, for the most part, we're like, okay, we understand this is myth, but there's truth here. And that's, I think, for a lot of us where we kind of have to end up. For Bible scholars, I think we need to keep throwing everything out and keep starting again. So I don't know where we're going to go with that, but I have so many questions about Acts, and I think it's so fascinating. Yeah.
Is there a next question that you are looking at when you're looking, like, there's probably too many to go into, but the one that you are like salivating to go into?
I want to do more work in Asia Minor. I had done a little bit with some of the inscriptions from Asia Minor, and it's fascinating when you look. I published something on the letters in Revelation, the 7 letters from Jesus in Revelation, and they look very similar to letters that sanctuaries in Asia Minor would collect to kind of show their antiquity and legitimacy. And they'd be like, look, we have this letter from like Darius or whoever. Like it's that sort of thing. I don't think they use Darius, but that's a different one. But they do that. Yeah, let's say maybe no. But they would keep their letters from Persian kings, and they keep their letters from Greek and even Roman leaders. So this is how these inscriptions would kind of function. So all that to say, coming to Acts, one of the things that jumped out at me when I was looking at the language of the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 is it's identical to a certain thing. If you've read a lot of inscriptions, you see this again and again, this language of the Jerusalem Council. It says in Greek, it's idoxin himen, I think, which means like, it seemed good to us or something like that. So this is the way that inscriptions in Greece and Asia Minor, especially everywhere, but like especially in Greece and Asia Minor, this is the way that councils give resolutions. And they'd use like this word, like, since it has been whatever, it seemed good to us to do this. And like, there's this very kind of formulaic writing you see in a lot of these inscriptions. And when you've read, 10, you've read 100, like it's kind of all the same after a while. And that's what shows up in Acts for the Jerusalem Council. So I think the author of Acts could probably get some of this language from the Maccabean literature, Josephus. Like, we do have literary examples of these stories, but it does really make me wonder if the Jerusalem Council is being modeled on civic government in Asia Minor. And you would actually have these groups in Asia Minor, these like koina, they call them, like collections of different for example, it could be like a koina of the Ionians, like the Ionian League, and like you could have these central bodies that would pronounce, and it would apply to several different groups. So that's like, to me, that's still such and a lot of people have done it. It's not like there's been so much done on Acts in the history of Asia Minor, but I do think a lot of the hardest hitting people have more done it from what we've been talking about, like establishing the authority, so you can say it's all true, rather than like, let's dive even more into what the author actually knows and what the author, and I think that, like, my hunch is that most of the Jerusalem stuff is patterned on civic government in Asia Minor. So I'd love to do more on that. So that's kind of where I nerd out in the epigraphy, the inscriptions, like trying to locate it there. And yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, is just understanding, because again, if we're taking away this story about the foundation of Christianity, but still seeing there's a lot in Asia Minor that looks like happened here, just more studying that more, I think is always interesting to me personally, not to everybody, but to me personally.
If you find that interesting, again, go and check out CJ's YouTube channel. The link is down in the description. There's a back catalog of things you're going to love, and you can stay tuned for when CJ gets into this in the future. But we're going to leave Acts alone here today. We'll stop poking its historical accuracies and inaccuracies. And again, focus more on what the author is trying to do when you're going through that is a helpful way, maybe. But CJ, thank you so much for taking the time today to come and talk about this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
It was great to finally have you on. Long-time viewer, first-time caller. Happy to have you around. I really love it.
Likewise.
If you have a question, send it down below. I'll be happy to bother CJ again if they have time. Wherever you find us, be sure to like and subscribe. It helps us. Hopefully it helps you stay in touch with us. But for this week, for all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, until next time.